A couple weeks ago, I was here at the Civic Center and realized, hey, after some needed repairs, our old bicentennial bell was finally back. And then as an historian whose mind is half in the past and half in the present anyway, it made me start to think about how Breans twice in our city's early history reacted to and dealt with threats to this country and also threats to world peace. The first of those threats began in 1917 when our flag, like this one here, still only had 48 stars. Steel derricks up in the hills above town began to replace the old wooden ones. The new grammar school, now Brea Junior High, was only a year old, and not long after Little Brea became an official city in Orange County. On April 6th of that year, President Woodrow Wilson and Congress declared war on Germany after that country had torpedoed and sunk 3 of our ships in the Atlantic. Almost at once, recruiting posters appeared all over the country, calling for volunteers to fight against the German Kaiser and his army. And then, by June 5th, the first numbers were drawn in a national draft lottery. Here in town, at the Brea Star newspaper office on Pomona Avenue, now Brea Boulevard, and at the Brea Progress office up the street, articles were written telling about local boys leaving for service, including the minister from the Brea Christian Church. And town businesses were running ads not only to promote their products, but also to show that they were supporting the war effort and our troops. Meanwhile, training of those troops had begun in camps all over the country to prepare them for the reality of war. And upon graduation, and after they had been honored in big city parades and cheered by thousands of people, the men crammed aboard waiting troop ships and set off for the long and dangerous trip across the Atlantic. Life, though, here in town went on basically as it always had. Families still dressed up and went for their Sunday drives, or maybe took the red car into Los Angeles. And downtown continued to be a place for shopping, holding community events, and somewhere to treat yourself to a sandwich or something to drink. By March of 1918, several Breans were already serving overseas, and local citizens were showing their support by hanging flags in front of their homes and displaying even more flags along the main street. In Europe, our newly trained soldiers were fighting and dying in the trenches, and were up against an experienced enemy that had been battling the Allies since 1914. To aid in the war effort here at home, Liberty Bond drives were held in town and were so successful that Brea was able to add an unprecedented 4th star to our Liberty donation flag. Our own Red Cross branch was really active during the war, and from its headquarters upstairs in the Sewell building, site of our first city hall, it was involved in all sorts of service projects, and even once took part in a downtown Fullerton patriotic parade. From overseas, Brea boys were writing home to their wives and families, and both the Brea Star and Progress ran some of these letters on their front pages, along with occasional photos of the soldiers who were writing those letters. There were also weekly reports in the papers of what our troops were doing in the war, dramatic drawings to drum up support for selling bonds, articles to show just how patriotic we were, and movie ads with titles fitting the country's mood at the time. The newspapers also called out for people to conserve to support the troops, and warnings were given not to waste what you had, but to buy sensibly whenever you needed to make a purchase. By the fall of 1918, it looked like the war was finally starting to wind down, but local boys continued to write home telling of fierce battles going on around them, or of losing friends or good acquaintances to enemy fire. On November 11th, the armistice was finally signed in the private rail car of French General Foch, and Breans happily heard the news with relief and excitement. In fact, that night some local boys gathered up all the old trash and boxes they could find, took it downtown and burned it in a big bonfire, with crowds looking on while somebody rang and rang the city fire alarm bell. The war was finally over for the United States. But just as our soldiers were returning to this country as heroes and receiving their discharge papers so they could head home, this area was hard hit by the worldwide Spanish influenza epidemic. Despite this, though, Brea had made it through the war years in good shape. And years afterwards, big Armistice Day celebrations were held in town to commemorate the day when the fighting had stopped. 21 years later, though, the world had changed, and Brea had taken on a whole new look. Our little town had now grown into a real city. And on February 23rd, in 1939, we celebrated our 22nd birthday. A little over 6 months later in Europe, though, when German troops marched across the border into Poland on September 1st, Britain declared war on Germany and World War II had begun. It wasn't, though, until Pearl Harbor was attacked 2 years after that Brea was once more forced into a time of war. Almost at once, warnings appeared here in the paper against possible enemy attack, and Brea underwent its first practice blackout drill. Again, businesses fell in line to sell their products, support the war effort, and to show their patriotism. Calls went out for local men to register for the draft, and our only Japanese-American family here was told it also had to register with the government as aliens of an enemy nation. Then, 2 months later, 21-year-old Haru, his sister Sadie, who was a couple of years younger, and their younger sister Martha, still in high school, were forced to go with their family to an internment camp in Arizona. 3 months after that, Brea Mayor W.D. Schaffer welcomed a large group of soldiers to town who would undergo extensive training here on how to operate and maintain oil wells. Rationing now began for all sorts of things, and people were given books of stamps to trade for certain items they needed. On the roof of Brea Linda High School, a temporary structure was built, and then later a more permanent one, to shelter volunteers who searched the sky for enemy planes. Just as in World War I, many Breans served their country during the war years between 1941 and 1945, including Eleanor Gein, who joined the Waves, and a lot of men in the various branches of the armed forces who were sent to all parts of the world, both as officers or as enlisted personnel, fighting on the front lines or aiding the troops in a support capacity. Some of these men were formally honored by the government for their heroism in action, but for others, it was too late, including the son of Brea Police Captain Bill Atkins and former Brea Linda High School student Conley Neal. In the South Pacific, Army pilot Ted Craig Jr., son of former Mayor Ted Craig, was lost in action, and well-known Olinda resident and pilot Jake Armstrong was captured by the Germans and served the rest of the war in a POW camp. On a happier note, Brea's Chicksand Company, once located at the southeast corner of today's Brea Boulevard in Lambert, was honored by our government in 1943 in a big formal ceremony for the work it and its employees had done in support of the war. A year and a half later, Brea was honored once again when the brand new tanker, the USS La Brea Hills, was launched in Sausalito to recognize the city's wartime contributions. And among those attending the event were Brea's Mayor Carlson and 2 council members. On May 8, 1945, the war finally ended in Europe when Germany unconditionally surrendered. But it wasn't until August that Japan formally offered its surrender. Like the rest of the United States, Brea celebrated the long-awaited peace, and soon our soldiers were making their way home to pretty much the same Brea they'd left months or years before. It had been a long struggle to preserve our freedom, but the struggle wasn't over yet because the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and our other conflicts were still in our future. This bell then represents kind of a thank you to all those men and women who served our country not only overseas, but also here on the home front. For this Did You Know segment of Video Brea Line, I'm Brian Saul.